My name is Gerry Low-Sabado. This was a historic event, in my opinion. Looking at the crowd, I think we estimated at about 300 people, 200 to 300 people. And basically what it is, it's an annual Walk of Remembrance to remember the Chinese village, Point Alones, where we're standing right now. It's a village that was burned down on May 16th, 1906. So the purpose of the walk is to remember that village, remember the folks that lived in that village, to bring awareness to the contributions that they made to Pacific Grove and the greater community. What Gerry would say? Oh, she would have been jumping up and down with joy. She would have been shaking everybody's hand, taking selfies, hugging everybody. This is a journey that she started more than 10 years ago, just to educate the community about her ancestors and about the Chinese village that was once here. Because for the longest time, people didn't know about this village. It was burned down, like I said, in 1906, and because of that, a lot of the Chinese left, and many of them didn't return. Gerry's family actually moved to Monterey, and they were one of the few that remained here. Everybody else, for the most part, left. And I think that's because they didn't feel welcome. They felt threatened. If your village is going to burn down, who knows, if they're not going to come back and try to find you.
I met Gerry. I did a story about a year ago. How does it feel for you that she wasn't able to see this?
It's been, very emotional for me. She passed away, in September. That's only 8 months ago. And, to be honest with you, after she passed away, I just wanted to be in my own grief, to be left alone. I didn't think I was going to get involved in what she was working on, but for some reason I felt this pull, and I'm pretty sure it was from her, to try to finish what she started. And even though it was difficult for me, I felt the need to try to complete what she started. It hasn't been completed yet. I mean, even though the city of Pacific Grove issued an apology, there's still a lot of work to be done. There still needs to be more education about not just the Chinese community, but the Asian community and all minority communities. A lot of the times our history, isn't told because we don't tell it. And the people that do tell history, slant it, or they don't tell the truth. And it's up to us to tell our story and to share that with them, and to have them understand what our ancestors went through and why maybe perhaps things are the way they are now. I'm going to take a rest for a while. This has been a long, few months to try to get this together. It was done with a lot of cooperation from other groups. But what we're going to do is maybe in a week or so have a sit down and talk about, kind of do a debrief about, what worked, what didn't work, what can we do better, how can we improve this, what else do we want to do besides this event, are there other things that we want to do, are there other communities that we want to, other ethnic communities that we want to help support in getting the word out about their history and the issues that they had to face. Most of the immigrant communities have gone through the same kinds of issues, and I think if we share that with each other and try to create coalitions with people, then we can bring this story to a wider range of people. And I think that's where ultimately the change will happen, is if you start telling the story and sharing it and bringing more and more people together. I was surprised. I thought that perhaps the city of Pacific Grove wasn't ready for an apology. You have to understand that the city of Pacific Grove, supported the Feast of Lanterns for many years. And this past year, we were able to really convince the Feast of Lanterns board to finally, end it. But up until that time, they were getting support from not only just the community, but also from the city of Pacific Grove. They were using city assets and city land and city resources to support, this event. And to be honest, I was surprised. I thought that there was going to be some pushback, that they would, the Feast of Lanterns Board was going to recommend some changes and, promise to do better. But in fact, they did say that they were going to meet with the community and they were going to make changes. They made some superficial changes, but they never met with the community. They just basically, said, well, okay, so you're offended by this, we won't even mention it. And that's not the point of it. What we wanted people to do is tell the true story, that there were Chinese here. If you're having a celebration a mile away from where the village burned, it's incumbent on you to tell that story. And I always thought it was somewhat disrespectful and racial to, have this play where you have Chinese characters played by people that aren't Chinese and wearing Chinese garb. And back in the 50s, they would paint their faces and put tape on their eyes to make it look slanted, and that was offensive. And even though that doesn't exist anymore, it's a history that needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be apologized for, and people need to understand why. You don't just say, okay, we won't even talk about that. That's not the point of it. You need to learn from that and hopefully incorporate people into that story. Not just say, well, okay, we won't even talk about this. And hope that it goes away.
And then, how do you want people to remember your wife?
She was passionate. Believe it or not, she told me that when she was in school, the teachers would say, you need to speak up more. And when she told me that, I couldn't believe it, because she is the most articulate, the most opinionated, the most passionate woman that I'd ever met. I would want people to remember her for her passion, her compassion, her smile. Her mantra was change with kindness. She persevered over 10 years in trying to make changes, and a lot of people would come to her and say, well, you're being too kind. You need to be, we need to be more militant about this. And she said, no, basically the change needs to come from within. And if you try to force it, maybe it'll happen, but they won't learn the lesson. They have to learn the lesson themselves. They have to make the change themselves. Otherwise, it's not true. It's just a program. So that's the way I would like people to remember. That she was a fighter. She was compassionate, and she persevered, even though she's not here. 15 years later, look at the changes that she helped start. And the moral of the story to me is that one person can make a difference. If you're compassionate, if you're persuasive, keep at it. If you try to do things with kindness, eventually things will happen. You just have to, you have to be patient. I've seen that change happening. In fact, a good example of that is, one of the past princesses and the past president of the Feast of Lanterns. I mean, an avid supporter and her family of that. She was the one, I'm talking about, Kay Coleman Clarity, who actually came forward after Gerry, passed away and issued a formal apology for her participation in the Feast of Lanterns. So if you can, get change from within, a person who is actually involved in that, like I said, that's where the true change comes. It's got to come from within, and people have to be educated. And that's the example that I like to point out. If someone from within can make that change, then anything's possible. In the near future, I'd like to see, the Asian community in the Monterey Bay Area kind of join together with different events. This is Asian American Heritage Month, Pacific Island Heritage Month. I would like to see events like this happen, not just in the Chinese community, but Japanese, Filipino, Korean. Maybe we do something together to educate the community about Asians. We all have gone through similar kinds of experiences in terms of discrimination and racial hatred. There's unity and support in numbers
pretty important because we're neglected, right? It's still a minority, and you wouldn't think it is, but it is a minority population.
Okay, and then is this your first time coming to this event, or have you been coming?
I try to come every year to the event, yes.
Okay, and then what's your favorite part about it? I mean, I know they're going to be doing a walk. I know they're also going to be, they have the dragon here. What is your favorite part about it?
I think just seeing the little model of what the village looked like. And it's sad that it kind of disappeared. And, it's a history that we kind of want to see and remember.
And what do you hope people take away from today's event?
Well, hopefully the culture and the history that what the Chinese did do when they came across the ocean and that junk, it's a large ship across the ocean. The families came over and started a village here and prospered by fishing all along Monterey Bay. Yes.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add about today's event, or even Gerry?
Gerry was so rambunctious, was never-ending woman. Yeah, she was a real dynamite person,
But for those of you who would like, we've reproduced pictures, historic pictures of people from the original Chinese fishing village. And those of you who listened to Professor Lighton's speech last night, he talked about how in Monterey we often talk about the sea life and the animals, but we forget the people. So these are the people who were in the Chinese fishing village that was burned down and forced out of Pacific Grove in 1906. And so if you'd like to help us honor them by bringing a picture, you can sign in here, and we'll be collecting them at the end of the march at the Hopkins Marine Center. Also, we want to remind you that after today's event, for those of you who love more beautiful scenery, this is going to be a great walk. We're going to be gathering at the Whalers Cove, or at the Whalers Cabin, and like I said, it actually was built by the Chinese and should probably be called the Chinese Cabin, where Quok was born, and you'll hear more about her. And we're going to have a special docent tour, and we're providing coffee. So that's tomorrow between about 9 o'clock to 2 o'clock at Point Golders. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Gerry Low-Sabado. We're going to be starting in a few minutes, but before the lion dancers do their dance, what they're going to be doing is passing around some red envelopes I see. So if you would care to, contribute to the lion dancers, please go ahead and do that. So we're going to do that first, and then we're going to have the lion dancers kick this off.
Right, so just an example, typically you put money into, not a lot, but you put money as much as you want. I'll take that. And then as the lions finish with the performance, you'll go around and collect the envelopes. But you have to show them the envelope because they can't really see anything.
So what we're going to do is go ahead and start with a quick performance by the Monterey Bay Lion Dance team. Hey, my name is Gerry Low-Sabado again. I want to thank you all again for coming. Hopefully this is a beautiful day in Pacific Grove. So I was going to make some few housekeeping announcements. First of all, I was going to say keep the street, cleared, but we have the PG's finest police department helping us out. So thank you very much, PG's Police Department. Okay, so a couple of quick announcements. Okay, before we start the walk, I just wanted to let people know that we're going to be going down this street and then to, the recreation trail. We have to share the trail with everybody else, so we want to keep people safe. So there are people that are walking around that have the yellow vest. If you could pay attention to them, they're going to try to help us keep safe by making sure that everybody crosses the street safely. We don't want anybody to get hurt. The other thing is, because we are sharing the trail with bicyclists and everybody else, we were trying to keep people to stay on one side of the trail. I know with, close to 200, 300 people here, that's going to be difficult. But if you could stay on the dirt side of the trail, that would be helpful. Don't block the entire trail because, again, we don't want anybody to get hurt. And also, at a certain point during the walk, the line dancers will stop the beating of the drums and the banging of the cymbals because of the harbor seals. This is the breeding time for the harbor seals, and we want to be sensitive to that. So at a certain point, they will stop beating the drums. Welcome. This is the 11th, I believe it's the 11th year of the Walk of Remembrance. Thank you again for attending. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is if everyone would please join me in a moment of silence for the villagers and for my wife, Gerry Low-Sabado. Okay, thank you. So this is going to be a little difficult for me, so I'm going to try to get through this. A little over 8 months ago, my wife Gerry took her last breath, and my world changed forever. A piece of me died when she passed away, but a big part of her will always remain with me. Today, I miss her more than ever, but my spirit is soaring to see how she positively impacted on so many people and made a tremendous difference. Many of you know that if she were here today, she would be smiling from ear to ear. She would be taking pictures. She'd be talking to you all. She'd probably be hugging you. That's just the way she was. So, in a way to help me, kind of get through this, On the count of three, those of you who have portraits of the villagers, can you please raise them? And everyone yell out Gerry. And let me take a hold on, let me take a picture of that. I haven't counted to three yet. Okay, ready? And I remember at the end of three, Gerry. 1, 2, 3. All right. Thank you. She was a person with a big heart, a great smile, and empathy for everyone. She will always remain a voice in my ear and a beat in my heart. At our very essence, Gerry was a teacher, a nurturer, a mom, who possessed unparalleled skills in communication, listening, collaboration, patience, and persistence. Most of us remember that one teacher that we admired who was the role model that motivated us to achieve things we thought were beyond our reach and control. Gerry was all of these things and so much more. She taught us, and more importantly, showed us how to live a principled life by treating everyone with dignity and respect. She chose to listen, build bridges, and advocate for what she called change with kindness. Today we remember and honor her life, along with the hundreds of men, women, and children of the Point Alonis, Point Almaeus Chinese village, whose homes were burnt down, whose belongings were looted, and who were evicted, never to return to a place they once called home. We also gathered today to hear a beautifully written apology recently passed by the Pacific Grove City Council in hopes that this community and this county or country will learn from the past and current injustices and can move forward together with a renewed spirit of hope and commitment to honestly working towards treating each other with kindness, respect, and a purpose to eliminate hate, discrimination, and violence. Thank you very much. What I'd like to do now is introduce Gloria Ibsen, who is going to give a short welcome in Cantonese.
各位，歡迎你嚟呢度。今日我哋係舉行呢個由醒獅團帶領嘅華裔漁民村落紀念步行。好多謝政府官員、警務處同埋博物館嘅職員，同埋各位義工同心合力策劃同埋推動呢一個活動，亦都歡迎各界人士踴躍參加。呢個步行係每年5月舉行嘅，希望你年年都嚟參加。
Thank you, Gloria. Could I have Jean Quan come up? So this is former Mayor Jean Quan from Oakland, who's going to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you. Actually, we're sometime residents of the Monterey Bay. We have a home here too, so this is our second home. And I'm very honored today to introduce the highest ranking Chinese American state official in the state of California, Betty Yee. She's our state controller. She actually has roots nearby. She started out in health administration in Santa Cruz and worked in San Francisco, was on the State Board of Equalization before she became the controller. But most important, I think those of us who know her and work with state government know she's probably one of the smartest and nicest people in state government. So a second generation Chinese American from Toisan. How many of you are from Toisan? You Chinese Americans, right? Fair number of you, okay. All right, and the other thing I just have to say is Randy is so modest. I have made him introduce himself. But I've been amazed and mobilizing for this and being part of the committee. How many of you personally know Gerry? So could you raise your hand if you met and knew Gerry? She amazingly touched so many people. And I hope that you'll help us and help Randy keep the tradition going. And next year, bring another person so that we can have even more fun. And really, I think this is the most important way to fight the whole, to stop the API hate crimes that have really surged in the last few years. So with that, I'm very honored to, like I said, one of the smartest and nicest people in the state government introduce Controller Betty Yee.
Thank you, Jean, very much. 各位大家好. It is really an honor to be here for this Walk of Remembrance with all of you. You know, I want to just also say to Randy, you know, for so many who are here as descendants of the villagers, this is really a day of healing and reconciliation. And it ought not be just the only day for that. And for all of you to be here and join us in this remembrance really means a lot to the descendants and to all of us as a community. Because we know that what happened to these villagers can continue to happen. And as we've walked through this Pacific Grove Museum of Natural History to learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act, to know that even to this day, that the Chinese American community as a victim of othering continues. And so as we do our Walk of Remembrance today, one of the lines that Sandy Leiden just talked about last night that really resonated with me, and that is, you know, allow history to breathe. And perhaps through those breaths, we can hear the voices of these villagers and what their experiences were. But more importantly, the courage of someone like Gerry to give voice to those experiences and of the Quok family, and to be able to have this be a part of our history, to know that for so many of the descendants, the gaps in terms of their history of their families are starting to be filled. And I can't say enough about that because for so many generations of Chinese Americans, there are a lot of gaps because there was a lot of pain. There was a lot of pain in terms of what so many of these families experienced with discrimination, and so many of their communities where they felt the safest were wiped out. And so this is not a one-off event, as you see, with momentum about apologies to the Chinese American communities, you know, throughout our country, throughout California. This is an event that I hope as you walk today, as you continue until we have our next remembrance, that you also give voice to the villagers who were here, who contributed so much to this region of California, and who really made a mark here in terms of this thriving community and economy here in the Monterey Bay. And so I just am really grateful to be here. I will tell you that as controller, I think about California as the 5th largest economy in the world, and our greatest strength is not financial and fiscal, it's our diversity. And for us to all be here, I think we all recognize that diversity is our greatest strength. It ought not be a threat. And let's continue to celebrate those who gave so much of themselves and lost so much along the way, to allow us to hopefully be a community that comes together and be sure that we are looking at each other to say, we see you, we hear you, you belong here. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, so we're going to have an introduction of the next speaker.
Thank you, Randy. I'm Louis Leader. I moved here 50 years ago. Let me tell you, this community has changed a lot in half a century, and congratulations to all of you for being here, and it's a real honor. I'm a retired journalist, and I wanted to introduce Susie Brusa, who's the district director for Congressman Jimmy Panetta. And before that, she served a dozen years as CEO of Rancho Cielo, which is a 100-acre campus in East Salinas, which offers education and career training and enrichment for underserved youth. She has a long background in the private sector. Congressman Panetta was first elected in 2016. He has fought long and hard for immigration reform. He's the grandchild of Italian immigrants, and all of us are immigrants unless you were an African American who was brought here in chains starting in the year 1618, or you were a Native American who was here long before Columbus, quote unquote, discovered America, or you were a Mexican who had been here for centuries. I myself, my mother was born in Romania, so I understand something about the immigration experience. And we all should always keep that immigration experience in mind. But without further ado, Susie Brusa, who will speak on behalf of Congressman Panetta, who had a prior commitment. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here on Congressman Panetta's behalf for today's Walk of Remembrance. Today we unite with pride with our Asian American and Pacific Islander community. With one voice, we respond to the sickness of race-based hate targeting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. For generations, Asian Americans have come here to build up the Central Coast and the state of California from the ground up, making numerous lasting and enduring contributions, most notably locally in fishing and agriculture. They came here to live the American dream. Even with such deep roots woven into the fabric of the Central Coast and the American culture, xenophobia, discrimination, and violence followed. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have endured this nightmare over generations, shaping the Asian American experience. Consider, for those of you not quite as familiar with the history of discrimination and violence, these regrettable incidents. The burning of fishing villages in the early 1900s, including one here in our own community. The imprisonment in intern camps during World War II. The murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. The scapegoating after 9/11, and the last 2 years of violence and hateful vitriol during the pandemic. Today we join as Asian Americans and non-Asian Americans alike against the hate that denies our dignity and the violence that degrades our humanity. We're outraged by these hateful acts of othering, but we are resolved always to do what is right in this country. And as we turn to do what's right, we must stand together, stand strong, stand up, speak up, never shut up against the hate that plagues many of our communities, including our Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Congressman Panetta was proud to be part of this Congress who voted for the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act to strengthen criminal penalties for hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. It's now the law of the land. He's also joined legislation honoring Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, recognizing the anniversary of the Atlanta spa shooting, and designating this last Tuesday, May 10th, as National Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Mental Health Day. Everyone has the right to pursue the American dream with pride. And we remain committed here on the Central Coast to forming a more perfect union, an equitable, more perfect union, where all belong. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I believe Clarity, are you going to introduce the next speaker? This is Clarity Coleman.
Thank you, Randy. Hello, my name is Clarity, but many of you in the community may have known me as Kay previously. I'm here today to introduce Wendy Root Askew, who is part of the Monterey County Board of Supervisors. I'm really excited to have her speak today. Wendy and I grew up here in Pacific Grove, and we grew up witnessing the Feast of Lanterns, and so we're happy to be here today to see this significant change in our community. And without further ado.
Wow, what an incredible crowd of people. I've got goosebumps just standing and watching all of this. So what an incredible crowd of people. Thank you all for being here. I want to start by thanking the Walk of Remembrance event organizers for their persistent and tenacious work to ensure that the contributions of our community, of our Chinese fishing village at Point Alonis, and the life of Gerry Low-Sabado are remembered and celebrated. Growing up here in Pacific Grove, my family attended the Feast of Lanterns, and my friends participated in the pageant. I was wholly unaware of the harm that the event was actively causing our Asian American community. It wasn't until many years later that I learned about concepts of privilege, of racism, and of bias. And I'll be honest, it's a process of continued learning and unlearning, and it usually isn't very comfortable work or easy work. but it matters. It matters that we collectively commit to learning about how our policies and our practices benefit some while continuing to harm others. It matters that we speak up when we see these things happening. It matters that we have elected leadership that are committed to updating our policies to ensure that they reflect the values of equity that we proclaim. As your representative on the Monterey County Board of Supervisors, I commit to doing this difficult work, to continue learning, and to support those around me on their journey of learning, to use my voice to speak up about policy and practice that needs to change, and to continue fighting to align our resources to uphold our values. I want to thank all of you who are gathered here today. This is an incredible crowd, for using your voices to speak out against injustice. It is because of your efforts that the city leadership here in Pacific Grove took action to adopt a resolution that will be read shortly and to change their policies. You have great power to lead change, and it is my deepest honor to continue doing this work with you. Thank you so much for being here, and keep using your voices. We need you.
Thank you, Supervisor Askew. Before we have the city actually read the apology, I'd like to ask if there are any other public officials here from any of the jurisdictions who want to say something. I'll give you a couple seconds. All right, I think so. We're going to move on to introducing city member from the city council. Oh, hold on a second.
Tyler Williamson. My name is Tyler Williamson, a council member from the city of Monterey. And I don't want to stay up here too long, but I just want to say that as a fellow council member on the peninsula, we stand here in partnership and allyship. There's not a lot of queer people of color in elected office, and it's great to have people that look more like a representation of our community, and it's beautiful to see that representation reflected in this audience today. So I just wanted to stand up here as an ally and thank the council and the city of Pacific Grove for taking a stand and moving the community in the right direction. So thank you all.
Well, it's a lot of people. It's good. I want to introduce our Pacific Grove City Council member. Chaps Puduri, who was elected to his position in 2020. Is that right? Yes. And soon became a part of the newly formed Pacific Grove Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force, where he serves as the council liaison. And we particularly appreciate the DEI Task Force for the work that they've done, including helping to develop this apology resolution, which he's going to read to us, and also his work on that task force. So please join me in welcoming Council Member Puduri.
Thank you everyone for being here today. All right, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for being here today. I would like to mention that along with me, I have a couple of other council members here as well. Council Member Joe Emilio. We also have Councilwoman Amy Tomlinson, and we also have the city manager here, Ben Harvey. I think he's taking pictures. There you go. As you can see, we have the Pacific Grove Police Department, and somewhere in this crowd here, we also have the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair, Tina Rao. If you're here, maybe there you go. So I would like to thank all of them for being here today. Gerry Low-Sabado was a fierce advocate for generations of local Chinese residents, and the Sabado family is continuing that tradition. So thank you, Randy. There are several other community members who have been instrumental in why we are here today, including former Mayor Carmelita Garcia, Janet Cohen, Sue Paris, Clarity Coleman, to name a few. There are several others, and like I said, not only thanking them, but it really does take a village for why we are here today. Last but not the least, thank you all for showing up here. And I know there are those of you who are listening in or watching on what is transpiring. This moment would not have been possible without all of you speaking up. The events of 1906 present a shameful chapter in Pacific Grove's history. There is a striking parallel between the events from more than a century ago to the unrelenting barrage of hate towards Asian Americans since COVID-19 began. Generations of racist rhetoric has been endured by community members, most often in painful silence. To end this deep-rooted discrimination and hatred, we must align ourselves as a community, recognize and tackle subjects that we have avoided or ignored, focus on community resilience, and help our families, our children, and the people around us understand how civic processes can help promote positive change. On that note, I would like to mention that the City of Pacific Grove had unanimously voted to institute a task force for diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2021. The DEI task force, and in particular Secretary Kim Bui, has spent several months in research, community feedback, and ultimately crafting this apology letter that I'm going to be reading to you today. It is truly exquisite. The City Council earlier this week unanimously approved for the apology resolution, and I hope that this letter really begins the healing process. I'm going to be reading the apology letter right now. The title reads, Apology to the Chinese village community and descendants for systemic discrimination, acts of fundamental injustice, violence and cruelty, seeking forgiveness and committing to the rectification and redress of past policies and actions. And these are the findings. Whereas the first men and women settlers from China arrived by ship before California statehood and were met with prejudice and discrimination. Whereas these men and women of Chinese heritage and their American-born children settled the coastline between Point Almejas and Point Alones in what is now known as Pacific Grove, creating a thriving community in 1851, the first commercial fishery on Monterey Bay, with fishing techniques and scientific discoveries still utilized today. And whereas the Point Alones fishing village became the largest Chinese fishing settlement in California, including women and children, growing from a few residents in 1844 to several hundred by 1906. Welcoming those seeking refuge from the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and was the first and largest family-based Chinese community in the United States at that time. And whereas in the early 1900s, growing anti-Chinese sentiment, town modernization, oceanfront real estate development, and resort interests resulted in the Pacific Grove Improvement Company attempting to evict Point Alones residents from Chinatown in 1905. And whereas on the evening of May 16, 1906, a fire of suspicious origin swept through the Point Alones village, one of many suspicious fires that occurred in most California Chinatowns from the mid-1880s to early 1900s. And whereas unable to stop this fire, village residents rescued belongings while hundreds of spectators watched, cheered the flames, and looted those belongings as residents rushed back to save more, until only 15 of over 100 buildings were standing 2 hours later. And whereas on May 17, 1906, local looters picked through warm ashes for village belongings, while that day, and for months later, the Pacific Improvement Company erected fences, posted guards, forcibly removed residents, refusing to leave, and tore down rebuilding attempts. And whereas following the destruction of the Point Alones village, a few residents and visitors noted the deplorable, disgusting spectacle of looters in a community dedicated to Christian principles, stating conscience, honor, delicacy, decency seem to be thrown to the winds. However, a more common local sentiment was, we wish them to be removed so far that they will never be any more trouble. And whereas until May 1907, members of the Point Alones village community resisted removal through land occupation, rebuilding, intercession by the US Army and Chinese consul, and legal means such as a demand for surrender of real property suit filed in 1906 by attorneys for 35 named Chinese residents. And whereas in May 1907, after the last remaining village resident, Quok Tuk Lee, left for Monterey, the destruction of the Point Alones village, the removal of its men, women, children, and families, and the eradication of their community, heritage, and history was complete. And whereas the history of structural racism and discrimination against Chinese immigrants and their descendants in Pacific Grove reaches back over 170 years. And whereas in the 1850s, immigrants from China were considered aliens, ineligible for citizenship, and therefore could not vote, they could not hold office, own land, with no rights to testify against white citizens. Whereas in the 1870s, the Naturalization Act denied naturalization rights, access to citizenship to Asians, and the Page Law prohibited recruitment of laborers and women for immoral purposes and was primarily enforced against Chinese. And whereas in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act specifically restricted Chinese immigrants, the first time a race and country of origin were so targeted, and was actively enforced for 61 years, including registration requirements, denial of bail, and bearing witness in court trials. And whereas in the 1890s, restrictive covenants were written into housing deeds, stating, the premises herein described shall not be in any manner used or occupied by Asiatics or Negroes. Buyers agree not to sell or lease the said property, excepting to persons belonging to the Caucasian race, nor to any lineal descendant, except that persons of said races may be employed as household servants. And whereas the effect of Pacific Grove's racial covenants is apparent in the change from the 1900 US Census record of 175 Chinese of various occupations residing at Point Alones to 1910 census records with only 5 Chinese residing in Pacific Grove, 2 servants, 2 gardeners, and 1 laundryman. And whereas ruled illegal in the 1940s, these racial covenants can still be read in Pacific Grove property deeds to this day. And whereas in July of 1906, the second Feast of Lanterns event was held half a mile from the burned, fenced, guarded Point Alones Chinese village site, occupied by protesting residents. And whereas revived in 1958, the Feast of Lanterns annual event featured racist and stereotypical caricatures of Chinese women and men, insensitivity towards the history of prejudice and Chinese persecution in Pacific Grove, and cultural appropriation of the authentic Chinese heritage looted and destroyed in the fire. And this event continued to be supported by the city of Pacific Grove into the 21st century. And whereas Chinese Americans have persistently fought back against discriminatory laws, structural cruelty, and systemic racism with every political, economic, and legal tool available to them, including civil disobedience at Point Alones. And whereas the rise in anti-Asian violence, racial discrimination, targeting and scapegoating during the current pandemic is again a shameful reminder of the ways the Chinese Americans of Point Alones and their descendants have been treated throughout our history. And whereas for over 50 years, the men, women, and children settlers of Chinese heritage, their American-born children and grandchildren, were able to settle, develop livelihoods, raise families, and create a thriving community at Point Alones in what became Pacific Grove, despite racial and discriminatory laws, prejudice, and harmful acts which touched every aspect of life, including housing, employment, education, marriage, and culture. And whereas the story of Pacific Grove's Chinese immigrants, Chinese American citizens, and the dehumanizing treatment committed against them in the 19th, 20th, and 21st century should not be purged, forgotten, or minimized in the telling of Pacific Grove's history. And whereas the city of Pacific Grove acknowledges and takes responsibility for the legacy of discrimination against early Chinese immigrants and subsequently against their descendants and others as part of our collective consciousness, that helps contribute to the current surge in anti-Asian and Pacific Islander hate crimes. And whereas the experience of Chinese immigrants in Pacific Grove can be used to build solidarity with other immigrant and marginalized communities here and in Monterey County, as similar discrimination and racism was and still is experienced by other communities. And whereas in 2010, the Pacific Grove City Council addressed modifying race-based restrictive covenants, in May 2011, May 2012, May 2013, and May 2019, the Pacific Grove City Council recognized the Point Almejas Point Alones Chinese Fishing Village and the many contributions made by the Chinese community, then and now, and the Walk of Remembrance. In September 2014, the city unveiled a plaque dedicated to the memory of the Chinese fishing village to bring recognition to the site of the village. And whereas a genuine apology for the role of the city in this history and legacy is an important and necessary step in the process of healing, reconciliation, and redress. And whereas the city of Pacific Grove joins other California cities, including Antioch, San Jose, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, who have issued apologies for their histories of discrimination and violence towards the Chinese community, Chinese settlers, citizens, and their descendants. And whereas an apology for grievous injustices cannot really erase the past, but admission of the historic wrongdoing committed can aid us in healing the pain of the past and solving the critical problems of discrimination and racism facing Pacific Grove and the broader United States today. Now, therefore, be it be resolved by the City Council of the City of Pacific Grove. Item number 1, the Council determines that each of the findings set forth above is true and correct, and by this reference, incorporates those findings as an integral part of this resolution. Item number 2, the Council apologizes to Chinese settlers, citizens, immigrants, and their descendants who came to Pacific Grove before and after it became a city and were the victims of institutional racism, prejudice, and discrimination. Item number 3, the Council acknowledges the acts of fundamental injustice, prejudice, and harm against the residents of the Point Alones Fishing Village community and their descendants whose effects linger to this day. Item number 4, the Council apologizes to the memory of those whose dignity was assailed, whose voices were silenced, whose homes were burned, whose belongings were looted, whose community was destroyed and scattered, and whose stories and history were lost or hidden due to racism, fear, protectiveness, or shame. Item number 5, the Council acknowledges the legacy of racism, prejudice, and discrimination from the city's treatment of Chinese residents, racist home deeds, long-time support of the Feast of Lanterns, and indifference to the lasting effects of institutionalized racism and the threat of personal harm. Item number 6, the Council recognizes the contributions, resilience, and persistence of the Chinese community and their descendants' commitment to seeking the truth, fostering reconciliation and friendship, and change with kindness. Item number 7, the Council resolves to rectify the lingering consequences of discriminatory actions and policies of the city, and to use this resolution as a learning moment for the public to move away from prejudice and racism towards inclusion, equity, and justice for all. Item number 8, the Council commits to programs and policies that can educate the community about this painful history of discrimination and its ongoing consequences, as well as provide for rectification and redress. And finally, item number 9, this resolution shall become effective immediately following passage and adoption thereof. This was passed and adopted by the Council of the City of Pacific Grove on the 11th day of May 2022.
All right. Thank you to City of Pacific Grove. It's been 170 years. Before we go start the walk, Kathy Biala, who distributed the pictures, wants to make an announcement.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Kathy Biala. I'm the Mayor Pro Tem for the City of Marina. I have to say that without this wonderful museum here, that all this crowds and all of the exhibits inside the museum would not have been able to be here, to occur today. So I really want to express appreciation for all the wonderful staff. It's been so great working with them. And for the Coalition of Asian Justice, for the Pacific Grove leaders, and the descendants of all the Chinese villagers who have come here from all over the state. So we want to welcome and thank everyone. These posters that some of you have already signed out for, we have more. Would you please just hold them up so we can get that last photo op of all of us here in this group? Thank you so much. And we still have some left, so please, on the walk, it's very important for us, for the people viewing us walking down the street, to see these. So please sign in over here at the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy. Actually, I apologize, I forgot. We have actually one more very important person to talk. And that is, well, before we have her talk, can I get a raise of hands of how many folks are descendants that are here? All right, thank you. Speaking of descendants, the next speaker is a sixth generation descendant. And I wanted her to talk at being a descendant after the apology, just to kind of get her reaction to that. So, Shelley Jen.
Thank you, Councilman Kohrs and the DI Task Force. I want to name the members Kim Bui, Tina Rao, Edward Juarez Lefevre, Nadia Mark, and Christy Markowitz. We are so grateful for your dedication and service to our community. My name is Shelley Jen. I am a sixth-generation Chinese fishing village descendant. My great-great-grandmother was Quok Moi, also known as Spanish Mary, the first documented Chinese woman born in California in 1859. She was a pioneering member of the community who spoke several languages and served as an interpreter for the diverse community on the Monterey Peninsula. And if you think about it, she's not really that different from most second gens that are here. The children who are born here, who can comfortably navigate between groups of friends, code switch, and help their families understand the systems and societal norms of America. But Quok Moi was literally the first one. Our people didn't come to this area, as many had done in the past, to create a bachelor society, make some money and go back to their homeland. It was not that transactional. Women and children came too and made this their new home. We developed techniques that we've talked about a little bit in fishing and conducted research, and basically made positive contributions to the Monterey Peninsula, like most immigrants, but we faced xenophobia and systemic racism. 116 years ago, almost to the day, when the fire burnt down their village, it really had a great impact on our family. We lost our home, all of our worldly possessions, the tools and equipment to make a living, and the means to obtain food for our family. It was devastating. Folks in the social justice movement often talk about intergenerational trauma suffered by victims of systemic racism. What does that really look like? Fast forward 20 years to 1926. My grandmother, Helen Joan, was Quok Moi's granddaughter. She was the oldest of 6 children in her family. And she was pulled from middle school at the age of 12. And after having a family business of being, our own family business of being fishermen, she had to work in the cannery, cleaning squid. It's kind of ironic. But our family needed her to work full time. They needed all of her wages to go to our family coffee can to contribute to our well-being. Grandma didn't like to share much about her childhood. Actually, she never really talked much about the past. But once she told me a story about her hard toil, wearing screened gloves to protect her fingers from the sharp teeth of the squid, and working these long, smelly shifts that left her hands stained with ink. She knew she had no chance to make it as a Chinese woman in America without an education. But for 4 generations, we were still just barely struggling to survive, and she couldn't even attend high school. As a young girl, I thought, my grandma is so bitter and distrustful of white people in mainstream society. Where did this anger and resentment come from? And only recently have I begun to put the pieces together to understand the heavy burden that she carried. She told me, Shelley, stick to your own kind. Don't ever walk alone. Put your head down and study hard. Never make waves for fear of being singled out. You know how they say babies aren't born with racism or prejudice? They're taught. Well, my grandmother taught me to be afraid, to be distrustful and not to dream too big. She taught me to fear non-Chinese. She put down other people of color when she wore her Chinese pins so they wouldn't think that she was Japanese, right, during the internment time. She bought the notion that minorities were competing in a zero-sum game. Helen looked around, my grandmother, and she thought her only chance was to get married and transfer her hopes and dreams to her children. And I'm happy to say that my mom and her siblings and other cousins of that generation were able to go to college. They were the first gen, even though they were the fifth generation here in America. The impacts of intergenerational trauma inflicted on my family haunted us for a long time. And most of us moved out of the area to find other places to live that were more welcoming to AAPIs. My cousin, Gerry Low-Sabado, was known for her mantra, change with kindness. Is it a coincidence that her behavior aligned with the model minority myth's dictations of how a woman, a Chinese woman, should behave? 2 weeks ago, Professor Russell Zhang, the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, gave a presentation at Chautauqua Hall down the street. The Stop AAPI Hate Coalition, which tracks and responds to hate incidents of APIs in the U.S., has collected over 11,000 reports of hate incidents since the pandemic began. Racism is always bubbling under the surface, waiting for a chance to come out. In times of strife, it's human nature to be tribalistic. But this is our call to action. On behalf of the Chinese Village Fishing Descendants, I'm honored to be here today to accept this apology resolution from the City of Pacific Grove. I know we didn't arrive at this point without the efforts of many organizations and individuals. I want to thank you for your unwavering support. And I, of course, need to mention my dear cousin Gerry Low-Sabado, who I think will be smiling down on us today because she finally got validation that she was heard. This apology resolution cannot make up for what happened to the Chinese fishing village descendants or people. It does not represent reparations, but what it does do is acknowledge the past. And this grounding is a starting point for us to appreciate our shared history in Pacific Grove and to move forward on behalf of all marginalized people to strive for a community that embraces diversity, equity, and inclusion. We believe in the power of restorative justice and are confident that if we continue the conversation and include a place at the table for all stakeholders and listen with open hearts, together we can create a stronger, more just Pacific Grove for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelley. That was tremendous. Next generation of activists right there. So before we start the walk, I just wanted to announce that with the help of the City of Pacific Grove, Police Department, and the City Manager, Ben Harvey, we can now walk down the street behind you instead of going on the sidewalk. We can walk down to the recreation path, and they're going to close it off so, you know, we can all be safe and we can enjoy the walk.
Hey, can you hold this for a second? Right on.
I got stuck.
I know. There's only one way down.
I know, right? I'm good. No, I'm good.
Right on. Thanks, Sid. Appreciate that. I was looking for a sidewalk and stairway down, but
I know.
Sorry for the delay. We'll be by soon.
Can you want? Sure. Thank you.
follow you. Yeah, we're with you, Randy.
I'm going to shoot a star.
My studio is right there. Entrance to my studio right there. Door right there.
Hey Wes. Hey David. For volunteering your time and all this.
Right on, no problem.
I'm watching on this.
Excellent.
To keep their kids in the public school in San Francisco.
Yes.
This is where the fish we go through here.
You've been busy today.
Oh, so we're at the end. Oh, this is it. That's not far. Almost, right?
Railroads.
Of course, it's railroad. I think Quok was the same. I think he was one of the other guys.
Hold on. Finish line.
Great feature ops, right?
So welcome to Hopkins Marine Station, the original location of the Point Loney's Chinese fishing village. Let's hear a really good round of applause for Point Loney's Chinese fishing village. I'm sorry, I didn't quite hear that. A little bit louder for the Point Loney's Chinese fishing village. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fiorenza McKelly, who is the director at Hopkins Marine Station. She's going to welcome you with open arms and say a few housekeeping messages for you. We're going to gather around here, and Fio's going to talk. Then Julie Cain from Stanford University is going to talk, introduce herself, tell you about the Chinese fishing village, and then I'm going to do the very best I can at telling you the story of the Quok family and how I'm familiar with it. Before I leave you, I'm also going to let you know one other thing. Does anybody know who Ed Ricketts is? Yeah. It's Ed Ricketts' birthday today. So we have a coinciding celebrations today. The Point Loney's Chinese fishing village and Ed Ricketts' birthday. And I'm going to tell you a story about Ed and Quok and how it all rolls together. With that, I'm sending it off to Fio.
Thank you, Don, and thank you all. I also want to welcome all of you to Hopkins Marine Station. We were unable to host the Walk of Remembrance over the past years because of the pandemic, and it's just wonderful to see everyone here and see so many of you again. I think this year has a very special meaning, the Walk of Remembrance. But what a couple of years this have been. I think that we have learned so much about what we need to do to take care of our environment, of all people. We all know that we need to do much better, especially those that have resources and the responsibility to do so. And we cannot, going forward, do better if we're not willing to look back and really recognize the harm, the impact of the past, and then with that knowledge, with that understanding, move forward and put our energies into a better future. And so I think we're here to remember, we're here to honor the people that lived here, their descendants, and really to listen to the stories. And I think that Don and Julie will start us off on that. So really welcome, and we are really thrilled to have you here at Hopkins Marine Station at the originals, which is in the original site of the Point Oloni, Point Almejas village.
What I'd like to do is the descendants of the village, if you guys could come up here and stand, because what they're going to do is, the orange, so they want somebody to accept the orange, and that's obviously has to be some of the descendants. So if the descendants could come up here.
So to facilitate making sure that the seals are not disturbed, we're not playing any percussion instruments because they're too loud. So we're going to be vocalizing and singing the equivalent of the percussion being played. So you'll hear the dancers and the team singing the performance for you all. It's going to be very interesting. You've probably never seen something like that.
But how we basically teach and memorize the
yeah. So hope you all enjoy.
Just pictures.
Monterey Bay Lion Dance Team. Thank you very much. And Cain's gonna talk to you about the history of the Point Aloni's Chinese fishing village.
So if you want to come closer.
Come on closer.
Everybody, welcome to Hopkins. It's so beautiful out here today. And if you use your imagination and you look over in this direction, the Chinese fishing village that was here from the early 1850s until 1907, the western end of the village was all through here where the Boatworks building is towards the road. And then the rest of the village was on that piece of land that stretches over towards Monterey Aquarium. So that's just to orient you. So what happens in California in 1848, gold is discovered. This brings people from all over the world to California. But not everybody, even though they came for gold, were able to successfully mine for gold. Many of the Chinese that arrived here had been told in China, oh, go to America, pick up a gold nugget off the street, and everybody wants you to come. And the Chinese that came found a very different California from the one they were initially expecting. And they were largely shut out of the gold fields by the miners, and the Chinese have a cultural past of being very resilient. What do you do when you can't do what you thought you were going to do? Okay. Sorry, she's just telling me not everybody can hear me, but this is what we got, people. so many of the Chinese here in California looked around and said, okay, what's left to do? And we have a huge inequality in the population. We have thousands of men come, but very few women. So a lot of the jobs that were acceptable. So now we have resilient Chinese looking around and saying, all right, what can I do? I can cook. I can do laundry. So this becomes two of the things that many of the Chinese do. So we have junks filled with Chinese families headed towards San Francisco in the early 1850s, and a storm blows the ships apart, and one or two ships end up in Mendocino, and other ships end up down here at the mouth of the Carmel River. And so those are some of the first Chinese that settle in this area. And in 1853, there's an abalone. There's an abalone rush, and so 500 to 600 Chinese travel from different areas, and from here, fish for abalone, well, pry bar for abalone. And once the rush is over, 4 families remain behind, and that is the nucleus of the Chinese fishing village. So by 1860, you have 15 to 20 Chinese living here. By 1870, you have nearly 50. And what's unusual is that nearly 50% of that 47 are women. So here you have a Chinese village that is unique, somewhat unique, in having so many families living here. And they're only fishing. They're not worried about looking for gold or making any other kind of a living. So the 1850s and 60s, the Chinese have no competition. They fish not only for abalone, but for everything else that's swimming in the bay. And then in 1874, the railroad comes through, and this introduces competition to them for the first time. Now we have Italians coming in, and they want to capture the fresh fish market, which the Chinese had never sought anyway. There's no technology to move fresh fish long distances in the 1850s and 60s. So there's some squabbling, there's some fighting, and pretty soon the Chinese are really only fishing from here, rowing down to Point Pinos, and then heading over towards Carmel Bay. And they're leaving Monterey Bay, first to the Italians and then ultimately to the Portuguese whalers as well. So in 1880, they decide to fish for squid. This was a type of fish that neither the Italians nor the Portuguese were interested in. And this gives the fishing village a whole new lease on life, because they can make so much money in the 2 months that squid season is, that they can literally afford to live here. They are paying $200 a month in rent to David Jacks, often a villainous figure in Monterey and Pacific Grove history. Uh-oh. Well, maybe not to everybody.
No, he is.
Anyway, in 1880, not only is there a big change afoot because of the squid, but the Big Four build Hotel Del Monte over in Monterey, and they become the new landlords for the Chinese fishing village because they buy literally something like 7,000 acres of property from David Jacks. And suddenly, these Chinese have a new role, an unintended role of being something for the tourists to look at as they're going on 17 Mile Drive, which of course was built by Chinese labor in the first place. And so through the 1880s, the dynamic of the population starts to change. Up till now, you've had more families and less single men. 1880s through 1890s, now you're getting more single men and less families. In 1892, Stanford University decides to build the Hopkins Seaside Station over at Lovers Point, and this brings a whole new opportunity for the fishers of the village, because now they're a part of the science experiments, which Don is going to talk about. So in 1896, the first cannery comes in, and that is a harbinger of bad things to come, because the way the Chinese fish and dry their fish is now obsolete with canneries on the horizon. And we have another problem, and that's location. Who wants to build a gorgeous house right on the edge of the ocean looking out? And what is standing there? A large village. There's no electricity, there's no plumbing. So it's starting to become an anomaly by 1900. Up until then, the Pacific Improvement Company was such a powerful landlord, the Chinese had their protection. If Montereyans or people living in Pacific Grove wanted to hassle them, they really had the protection of the PIC. And this starts to shift in about 1905. There's so much pressure brought upon the PIC from local residents to not renew the lease, despite the fact that now the Chinese have been here almost 50 years. And the PIC struggles between, well, they're not hurting anybody, and yeah, okay. So another fateful event happens, and that is the 1906 earthquake on April 18th. And the unintended consequence here was that, of course, Chinatown in San Francisco burned completely to the ground by 12 noon the first day of the earthquake. And now you had literally thousands of Chinese as refugees looking for a place to settle, because it certainly was not a for sure thing that Chinatown was going to be rebuilt in San Francisco. And I've read different reports. Some say 50 Chinese showed up, some say 100, some say 150. In the village already, there's maybe 155, maybe 200 people. And as a historian, I look at that and I see the size of the village double overnight when it's already been under pressure for the past 5 years to move along. And what do we have? Somebody making a decision, perhaps, to help the removal of the village along. And a fire starts on May 16th. We don't know for sure if it's arson. There were 3 villages in the fire in the past. You're living in a very precarious situation. They had one hose bib that did not have a lot of water pressure. And so the way they fought the first 3 fires was to tear buildings down and try to create a fire break. And they did the same thing this time, but out of 100 buildings, give or take, anywhere from 7 to 16 of those buildings are what survived. And so the PIC put up a fence and armed guards around the burned out section, and many of the Chinese crowded into the few buildings that were left. Some, of course, just kept on moving, but those that had lived here for generations were not so inclined to move along. And they spent the next year squabbling and fighting, and of course the Chinese were armed as well. To me, it's a freaking miracle nobody shot anybody. You had plenty of people beating each other up, and the Chinese would try and go build, and the guards would come and tear it down. And the PIC put up new cottages across the road over in that direction. Chinese had no interest in moving there. They let them just stand empty. Meanwhile, you've got another local, J.B. Maccabee, who's got a beach a quarter of a mile?
Yes.
That away. And he offers to lease to the Chinese. Doesn't talk to anybody in Monterey or Pacific Grove about it. And of course, they're having a snit fit, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. So the last of the village moves out. Jerry's great-grandfather is the last villager to move out on May 16th, 1907. And you've got some 80 Chinese that literally moved from here down to Maccabee Beach. And so that is just a very, very quick history of the village. I could stand here and yak about it for hours. But Don is going to talk to you about Jerry's family.
It's been a wonderful audience, I tell you. A wonderful audience. So as I mentioned earlier, today's Edrica's birthday. recently a book got published by Richard Astro and myself, Donald Kohrs. How about that? It's about the publishing of Between Pacific Tides, Stanford University's #1 selling book. Well, there's a lot to this story of the publishing of Between Pacific Tides and Ed Ricketts. And more importantly, that story weaves through the Quok family. Quok Moi, Quok Tuck Lee, and Chin Yip. So Gerry Low-Sabado used to come visit me in the library where I'm at, and I'm working on the history of Hopkins Seaside Laboratory. And I keep coming across his name, Quok Tuck Lee. And Gerry would come in and talk about Quok Moi, and once I mentioned Quok Tuck Lee, and she said, "Oh, that's my great-great-grandfather." I'm like, oh my gosh. So we started putting the story together a little bit more about Quok Tuck Lee. Great Chinese fisherman, a multilingual, registered devote, born in America, and he is the go-to fisherman by the Hopkins Seaside Laboratory scientists and visiting scientists from around the world to find hagfish embryos. You can barely find a hagfish embryo today using the ROV technology that the MBARI has, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. But Tuck Lee knows where to find these hagfish embryos. He's really good at it, right? So there's always this connection between, and it keeps coming up, Tuck Lee finding these hagfish embryos. And he's finding chimera fish also for this character named Bashford Dean, right? So I got the Quok Tuck Lee story, going pretty good. Well, I also have all these collecting cards by Ed Ricketts that he left to Hopkins Marine Station in his will after he passed away. We all know he got hit by the train down there along Cannery Row, right? I believe it's on Drake Street, where the statue is. Well, these collecting cards identify people who collected specimens for him. And this guy's name keeps showing up. Chin Yip, Chin Yip. So, Gerry Low-Sabado comes to visit me again. I said, "You know anything about this guy named Chin Yip?" "Oh yeah, that's my grandfather." "Oh, great." So we started that bit of the story, putting that bit of the story together. Chin Yip and Tuck Lee. And then, as I'm researching Ed Ricketts, like I say, Ed's uses Chin Yip. He's his primary collector. Help him to identify specimens, bringing specimens in for Ed to sell or contribute to scientists that he often does around the country. And so we put that story in this book, a tidal odyssey, the making of Between Pacific Tides. So I'm going to read that section to you if you'll bear with me. You want to hear it? Yeah. You sure? Yeah. You're not bored to death yet? No. I don't want you to be bored. I don't want to hold you here. Okay. Ed's patience was running thin. Seeking a diversion, he wrote George McGinty in February 1938, commenting on one of McGinty's recent publications, and for some unknown reason telling McGinty about the Chinaman, his friend Chin Yip, who for years had collected specimens for Pacific Biological Laboratories. Young Chin Yip and a number of other Chinese fishermen form an interesting backstory to the saga of Between Pacific Tides. Chief among the characters is Quok Tuck Lee, one of the most entrepreneurial members of the small Chinese fishing community, once located on property where Hopkins Marine Station stands today. Quok collected specimens for several Hopkins residents and visiting scientists. For help, he taught his nephew, Chin Yip, how and what sort of critters to collect. Chin Yip, in turn, collected for Ed. Young's home was at 744 Wave Street, New Monterey, just a block up from the Pacific Biological Laboratories. Over time, he and Ed became good friends. Numerous biological survey cards mention Chin Yip and identify the specimens he collected for Ed. I must also note, Gerry Low-Sabado helped us critique this section, and she provided some very good corrective comments. So I just do want to recognize her
as I turn this cruddy page. Okay. Here's a little bit more of the story, right? So here's about Nan Ricketts, right, is the wife of Ed Ricketts. In her recollections, Nan Ricketts tells of how indispensable Chin Yip was to Ed and how they befriended the Youngs every Christmas. In quotes, one of our most dependable shark collectors was Chin Yip, a Chinese fisherman. He wanted to be paid once a year and only once a year of the only on the week of the Chinese New Year. We understood that according to their religion, all debts were to be paid before New Year. On that day, our family, the Ricketts family, was invited to the house to partake of their specially prepared food and drink their liquor, which was pretty potent. John Steinbeck occasionally saw and talked of Chin Yip at Ed's lab, and likely used him as the model for the old Chinaman in Cannery Row. So that's my story that's in this particular book about Quok, Tuk Lee, and Chin Yip. Quok Tuk Lee was pretty much like the mayor of the whole Chinese fishing community here, bilingual, registered to vote. He was the last Chinese fisherman to leave this village. Everybody's house burnt down. His house was pretty much right over there where the Monterey Boat Works is, facing that area. Tuk Lee's house did not burn down. Tuk Lee did not want to go. And he eventually did go down to Maccabee Beach. The other interesting thing about Tuk Lee is that he was pretty well off. He made some pretty good money. He had one of the earliest, or the newest, or let's put it this way, the first gas motorized fishing boat to sit in Monterey Harbor, right? And if you even dig further into this story, you find this one guy named Barack Obama associated with this. And you're saying, Don, how can you associate Barack Obama with Quok Tuk Lee? Well, do you know the story, Nancy? Nancy doesn't know the story. Nancy is a descendant of the Quok family. So I kept on digging this up. The story comes up when the whole idea of the birther situation for Barack Obama, whether he's married in the United States or not, they turned to all these previous Supreme Court cases. And you look far enough, there's a story for Quok Fat Yung, which is Quok Tuk Lee's son. Quok Fat Yung goes over to China, and he needs to get back in. But this is during the Chinese Exclusion Act. Somebody claimed that Quok Fat Yung was not Quok Tuk Lee's son, but in all actuality, he was. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court and is used to this very day to determine residency of American citizens, whether their parents were residing in the United States or not. As they found in the case, they didn't even recognize, they didn't care if Quok Tuk Lee was an American citizen. What they were concerned about was both parents were residing in the United States of America when that child was born. So the precedence was that Quok Fat Yung was a U.S. citizen. And let's hear a round of applause for that. And with that, that's a good start of my story. There's a lot more to this story. If you really need to know it, it's at seaside.stanford.edu. You go to seaside.stanford.edu, you drill down into Chautauqua, there'll be a link to Feast of Lanterns, and it'll tell the story of the Feast of Lanterns, the fires, and then we go in the Quok family. And it gets interesting. And it continues to build as years go by, and we learn more and more about the family of the Quoks. So with that, if you have any questions, do you want to start? Yes. I'm sorry?
Was Tuk Lee the one who was the gentleman, the grandfather who was blind? Who was a blind grandfather?
I have not
Well, repeat the question.
Blind grandfather.
No, it was
So, Nancy, who was it?
It was Quok's husband who went blind.
Quok's husband went blind, yeah. So now we've got that bit of the story told, right? And they, I assume, lived down at Wave Street Studios. Other questions?
I'm wondering if you could talk about voting rights at all. My son is actually writing a paper on voting rights. I think his teacher intended for him to focus on African American voting rights, but I'd love to hear about the voting rights of the people in this area.
Well, I don't know too much about voting rights. I'm only Branch Library Specialist 3 in the Miller Library. All I do know is that Quok Duck Lee, he's born here, and it's 1890, and he's already registered to vote. And during that period of time, you're requested, at least as I've looked through California, to register to vote almost every 3 years to keep up with the ballots, to make sure that you are on the list. Everything's old school back then. They don't have any computers anymore, but everybody willingly and participated in the voting rights. You have any voting rights? Julie has no voting rights comments. Anybody else?
Basic question, where was the village? Where did it start? Where did it end?
Basic question, where was the village, right? The village pretty much, as best I can tell, starts from about here, and Julie, does it go all the way towards the Monterey Bay Aquarium?
Yeah. This would have been the far western end of the building, so the families all lived in this area here, and then if you go look at the cove that's between here and the Monterey Bay Aquarium, there was a whole line of shacks, houses, cabins, sheds, whatever you want to call them, because it's all kinds of different stuff, a lot of it jury-rigged. And that line stretches almost the length of the cove, and it did have one street coming in between. So you had houses backing up towards where 17 Mile Drive would have been. Then you had the houses along the water were jutted out over the water and built up on stilts. I can only imagine how many times a wave would have washed over those houses. It's a miracle the village stood as long as it did, but that's where it was.
Thank you.
Questions? Any more questions?
So did people live in the buildings over by the cove? Were they buildings used for something else, or were they houses for people?
Well, the buildings, as far as I understood it, were their homes, right?
It was a combination.
Oh, Julie tells me it's a combination.
For the most part, it was residences, but when you look at photos, you'll see a sign up on the door for one place, and it was for an employment person. So if you were looking for a job, you went and talked to that person. And then the 1850s and 1860s, up through the 1870s, you've got a lot of fishermen. But by 1900, only 61% of the village are fishermen. And what the other villagers were doing, they could have been working at the hotel, they could have been working anywhere in Monterey or Pacific Grove, but what they were doing, I'm not exactly sure. But primarily, those were residences.
Julie, can you talk about what sort of municipal buildings or structures they had in terms of schools, governance or anything like that exist in the village?
Repeat the question.
She's asking how the village was governed, and Don sort of touched on it already by identifying Quok Lee. Before him was Tim Wong. He was the liaison between first David Jacks and then the PIC. He's murdered in 1885 because he is trying to keep vice out of the village. There's, in the early years when it's predominantly families, there's no official brothel, there's no gambling, there's no opium, all of that's going on X amount of blocks over at the Monterey Chinatown, and of course other Chinatowns spread throughout the peninsula. Tim Wong worked very hard to keep the village family-oriented and relatively trouble-free. After his death in 1885, the impetus for either single men or men whose families are back in China to move in just get stronger and stronger, and the families lose less of their ability to have a say about what's going on in the village.
How about schools? How about schools?
Excellent question. Of course, no Chinese children in California are allowed to attend a public school. That was mandated in 1850. No black child, no Native American child, and no Chinese child would attend a school with white children in it. So the earliest children here had no education whatsoever, and whatever their parents taught them. In 1883, one of the women who was part of the Chautauqua Methodist Episcopal person opened a mission school, which I believe was somewhere in the vicinity of where we're standing. It was on the western end of the village.
Yeah.
She taught kids, Chinese kids, about 20 kids per year. The kids from here and the kids from Pescadero who walked over. Tell me how far that is.
A mile.
Okay. From 1883 to 1894. And then after her death, the mission just ultimately closed. Somebody from the village formally requested the Pacific Grove, I don't know what they would have called it back then, whatever the school that was appropriate for that age, if the Chinese children could attend. And they were told yes, but they had to wear clean clothes and they could not bring their little brothers and sisters to class to be babysat during school, because apparently that took place on a regular basis when they were in the mission school. And so really, from 1895 onward is the first chance children living in this village had to be educated within a larger society.
Jerry will close, so thank you all for coming and listening to us. We're sorry about the volume. We'll work on some of that next year.
Okay, I get one more round of applause for Don. Yeah, we apologize for the sound system. We wish we could have been indoors, but because of COVID, obviously we had to do this outdoors. Before I close, I wanted to introduce Amy Chin Mills, who is running actually for Board of Supervisors for Santa Cruz County, and she wants to just make a quick announcement. So, Amy.
Hi, thank you so much. If I do win, I'll be the first Chinese American to serve on the Board of Supervisors in Santa Cruz County. And I want to also say Natalie Lowe is here. Where's Natalie? She and I work together on a radio show, and she works so hard with Gerry to also get these things going that are happening now. And anyway, I just want to acknowledge Natalie because I know she's done a lot of hard work on this. And I also want to say that next Saturday, if you're in the area, the Asian Americans of the Santa Cruz area are having an Asian American Heritage Day and Festival in Santa Cruz at the Galleria. If you know where that is, it's next to the Trader Joe's, right in the courtyard in the Galleria from 11 a.m. until 5 p.m. Natalie, is there anything I should add? No. So please join us because, you know, there's a new generation of Asian Americans kind of taking Santa Cruz by storm, and Natalie's part of that. And so please come on up on Saturday and join us and help us out. Thank you.
I want to thank you all. This has been a tremendous day for me. The descendants and everyone. This is the largest Walk of Remembrance group we've had. All of this is due to the work of a committee. Too numerous to mention, but this is a collaborative effort. We hope to continue this year, next year and the years that follow. It's an important story. It's a story that needs to be told, not just here in Monterey, but there are a number of Chinese villages and towns that were burnt down. This Pacific Grove, I think, is the fourth or the fifth city in the state of California that issued an apology resolution. But there were hundreds of Chinese villages in the state of California that burnt down. And so there's never been an acknowledgement of that. So your help in doing that and the City of Pacific Grove commitment to doing that was tremendous. Lastly, I just wanted to say, if Gerry were here, again, she would be, shaking your hand, hugging you.
You would have found somebody that was a new relative.
Yeah, she would be taking your pictures. In honor of Gerry, I just want to give you my own virtual hug. So thank you.